In ancient Rome, the act of escape was not simply a private gamble for freedom, it was a direct affront to the Roman order itself. For a society that prided itself on hierarchy and discipline, a fugitive slave was more than a runaway. They were a living challenge to authority, a reminder that even the might of empire could not crush the human will entirely. And for enslaved women, the punishments were layered with a cruelty sharpened by gender punishments, not only of pain, but of humiliation, designed to stain body and spirit forever. One of the earliest and most enduring punishments was branding. The hot iron, glowing from the forge, was not pressed in haste but with ritual deliberation. On the forehead, where concealment was impossible, the letters FVG, short for fugitivus, were burned into the skin. Some masters went further, inscribing entire phrases such as Teneo te fugitive, I hold you, fugitive. It was more than a scar, it was a proclamation. To be branded, fugitiva meant to carry on one's face a permanent declaration of shame, a warning etched in flesh. Branding was rarely private. Women were often restrained while the metal seared their skin, their cries mingling with the insults of those around them. The pain itself, though searing, was less enduring than the scar it left. For Roman women, even enslaved one's appearance was bound to notions of dignity, modesty, and worth. A mark on the face was more than disfigurement. It was social exile. No disguise, no borrowed garment, no whispered lie could hide it. The iron had already spoken. The cruelty of branding lay also in its symbolism. A woman's body, already treated as property, became a public notice board. To passers-by, she was no longer just a servant, but corrupted property, damaged and disgraced. To other enslaved women, she was a living warning. This is what happens when you defy. Branding thus worked both ways, punishment and propaganda, pain and deterrence fused into one ritual of domination. Yet branding was not the only punishment Rome devised to blend discipline with spectacle. Another was chaining at the gate, the punishment known as adienuam. Imagine a woman shackled to the very threshold of the master's home, the domus, where family honor was guarded with jealous care. The doorway was both a literal and symbolic threshold, a passage between public street and private household. To chain a fugitive woman, there was to make her part of the architecture, not as a person, but as an object lesson. There she stood or collapsed, exposed to sun, rain, and the gaze of every passerby. Her presence transformed the household entrance into a stage of humiliation. Neighbors, guests, strangers in the street, all were meant to look, to understand, to whisper about what they saw. Rome was a society obsessed with visibility, and in this cruel display, visibility itself was weaponized. For enslaved women, the punishment carried an especially sharp sting. Roman culture linked a woman's virtue to her modesty and her hiddenness. To be exposed, shackled, perhaps even half-clothed before strangers was an assault not just on the body, but on womanly honor itself. The intent was not merely to correct behavior, it was to degrade. Even Roman comedy reveals traces of this practice. Playwrights like Plautus make casual jokes about slaves left hungry or mocked while chained near the doorway. What the audience laughed at was a distorted reflection of real suffering. Archaeological finds of iron shackles embedded in villa walls only confirm that such punishments were woven into everyday life. It was discipline made visible, humiliation transformed into a deterrent as ordinary as the threshold of a home. But some women were punished not only before the eyes of a household or a neighborhood, they were thrown before the eyes of an entire city. Among the most brutal penalties was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was no private whipping, no solitary branding. It was a spectacle, a performance, a death designed as entertainment. When enslaved women fled and were caught, especially repeat offenders, they risked this ultimate punishment. They were marched into arenas not as gladiators but as victims. Stripped, chained, unarmed, they were offered to lions, leopards, or bears, their screams swallowed by the roar of the crowd. Some were burned alive in elaborate stagings of mythological tales made to play the roles of doomed heroines like Andromeda or Dirce, but with no hope of rescue. Others were forced to fight one another with minimal weapons, not as trained combatants, but as doomed entertainment. The Roman crowd, desensitized by constant bloodshed, came not to watch justice, but to revel in cruelty. Women in particular were displayed in ways meant to humiliate. Bound in mock costumes, cast as sacrificial figures, their bodies transformed into symbols for the crowd's amusement. The historian Suetonius tells us of women in the arena, though he tends to focus on elite-born female gladiators. But inscriptions and legal texts confirm the truth. Enslaved women condemned for defiance were thrown into the pit, their deaths not accidental, but orchestrated. For the Romans, this was not just punishment, it was deterrent elevated to theatre. A runaway woman's body became a message. You may resist, but you will be broken before all. What better way, in their eyes, to reassert control than through a death so public that it erased not only life, but dignity, memory, and identity itself? The spectacle of pain was central to the Roman imagination. Whether by the iron, the chain, or the arena, enslaved women who sought freedom were transformed into instruments of terror, their suffering woven into the social fabric as both warning and entertainment. Each punishment reinforced the same truth. In the Roman world, a woman's defiance was never her own. It was a crime against empire, answered in fire, iron, and blood. If branding and public spectacle were punishments designed to leave marks on the surface, on the skin, on the face, on the memory of a watching crowd, then whipping was the punishment designed to cut into the body itself. In Rome, the whip was more than leather and cord. It was authority made tangible, a symbol of power wielded without limit. For enslaved women who dared to flee, whipping was among the most common and immediate responses. The flagrum, Rome's infamous scourge, was no ordinary whip. It was often crafted with multiple leather thongs, sometimes weighted with bits of metal or sharpened bone at the tips. Each strike did more than sting, it tore into flesh, splitting skin, raising welts, leaving permanent scars. The sound of it was as feared as the pain it delivered. No Roman law restricted the number of lashes. A master could order 10 or 100 or more, depending on how deeply he felt his authority had been insulted. A woman who had attempted escape did not simply face physical punishment. She faced the humiliation of being displayed to others afterward, her torn garments, her bloody back, her collapse in front of fellow slaves or townspeople. In some cases, she was left in public places like markets or workshops, her suffering made visible as a living warning. For women, the cruelty of whipping was magnified by the cultural expectations of modesty and bodily integrity. To be stripped, beaten, and left exposed was as much an attack on dignity as on the body itself. And because the enslaved had no legal protection, whipping often became a prelude to further punishments, branding, chaining, or worse. It was not always the end, but the beginning of a chain of suffering. What is perhaps most chilling is how normalized this practice was. Roman writers Horace, Juvenal, Petronius mentioned beatings as casually as one might mention daily chores. A slave being whipped was a fact of life, not a tragedy. In satire, it was even a joke. That casualness reveals the deepest cruelty. Violence was not the exception, but the expectation. To whip an enslaved woman was to remind her and everyone watching that she was not a person with rights, but a possession whose body bore the mark of obedience or rebellion. Yet even the whip, brutal as it was, could not compare to one of Rome's most feared sentences, deportation to the mines. Known as damnatio in metallum, condemnation to the mines, it was a punishment that was, in essence, a slow and certain death. Mines across the empire, Sardinia, Dacia, Noricum, were places of living hell. Air choked with dust, shafts so narrow that workers crawled on their knees, the constant threat of collapse, the poison of mercury, and lead seeping into lungs and skin. To be sent there was to vanish into darkness, swallowed by the earth itself. While men were more commonly sentenced to quarrying and mining, enslaved women were not spared. If their escape was seen as repeated, defiant, or particularly humiliating for a master, the mines awaited them too. They hauled stones, crushed ore, dragged baskets of debris. Overseers drove them with whips, and guards inflicted abuse unchecked by law or conscience. There was no limit to what could be demanded of them, no overseer feared punishment for cruelty. For women, the experience carried unique terrors. Pregnancy was no protection. Some gave birth in the mines, their newborns dying within days from hunger or exposure. Others endured sexual violence from guards, their bodies doubly exploited in places where even daylight was rare. There was no reprieve, no hope of return. To be sent to the mines was to be erased from the world above. The sentence was almost always lifelong. Few survived long enough to be released. Death came from exhaustion, starvation, disease, or simply despair. Unlike branding or arena execution, the mines were not meant to be seen. This was punishment through disappearance. A woman condemned to the mines was not a spectacle, she was an absence. She vanished from her household, from the street, from memory, her suffering hidden in darkness, her end unrecorded. Together, these punishments, branding, chaining, the arena, the whip, the mines, formed a system of terror. They were not random cruelties but carefully chosen tools, each carrying its own message. Branding said, "You will never hide." Chaining said, "You are nothing but a warning." The arena said, "Your death entertains us." The whip said, "Your body is ours." And the mind said, "You will vanish, forgotten." For enslaved women, the weight of these punishments was doubled. In a society where even freeborn women were subject to control and scrutiny, enslaved women carried the heaviest chains subject to forced labor, sexual exploitation, and punishments designed to silence both body and will. Their defiance, when it came, was met with punishments not only to crush rebellion, but to annihilate dignity itself. Rome prided itself on its laws, its order, its civilization. Yet within that proud order lay a system built on pain, where the suffering of enslaved women was transformed into spectacle, deterrence, or erasure. The empire endured in part because it made rebellion unthinkable, or at least unbearable. It ruled not just through legions and law, but through the whip, the iron, and the mines. And yet, even amid cruelty, memory lingers. The marks of branding, the echoes of the whip, the ruins of mines, all remind us that behind the faceless term slave were individuals, women who dreamed, resisted, and suffered. History has often silenced their voices, but the punishments Rome inflicted on them still testify to their defiance. As Seneca once warned his fellow Romans, servi sunt, immo homines, they are slaves. No, they are human beings. His words echo across centuries, a reminder that cruelty disguised as order is no less cruelty. And the women who bore the marks of Rome's punishments remind us that even in the darkest systems, the yearning for freedom was never extinguished.